Welcome back, everybody. This is Fantasy Football 201, an advice show within this channel for fantasy football. So in today's video, we will talk about the Seattle Seahawks. We only have 4 team previews left. It's been a grind, but we're getting our way through. Any team alphabetically listed before Seattle, I have a video on. So in today's video, we will talk about the Seahawks, and then we'll finish our last 3 teams, Tampa Bay, Tennessee, and Washington, over the next week and a half. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, I'm making videos about every team to help you win a fantasy football championship. So if you're interested in that, please check out my channel. And consider asking questions on this channel because I don't have a lot of subscribers and I want to take the time to help you. So if you need somebody to use as a sounding board for questions or just get fantasy football advice in general, comment below and I will answer you. Also, check out my channel for other content as well. I make a wide variety of stuff that you can see in the description below. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the Seahawks, as I mentioned, and I always start out these videos with a trivia question about the Seahawks. So, Seattle, how many draft picks did they have in this year's NFL draft? It's one of the lower numbers of teams in the NFL this season, but if you can guess how many draft picks Seattle took in this draft and comment that below, then I will answer one of your fantasy football questions and give you a shout out for your support to the channel. And if you stick around, I might just give you the answers, so keep that in mind as well. So we will go to the Seahawks schedule and preview what matchups look good for them. So the Seahawks have a very difficult schedule to really go on a stretch run. They play a lot of tough defenses, a lot of that because they have the 49ers and the Rams in their division. Arizona also expected to improve, so that doesn't necessarily help them. And they're also they play some other good defenses as well that are mixed in their schedule too. So we'll go through what looks to be the good stretch for them. But just as an example, they start the season at Indianapolis, which projects to be a good defense, and then they play the Titans, not a very good defense. Minnesota, about middle of the pack, and then San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Pittsburgh all back to back. So that's pretty tough. They do have the best stretch of games in the best matchups later in the season. In Week 8, they have Jacksonville. In Week 10, 11, they have 2 relatively mediocre defenses in Green Bay and Arizona. Week 14, they play Houston. Week 17, in that projected fantasy football playoffs, they play Detroit. So they have some good matchups, but they also have to play a lot of very tough defenses as well. So keep that in mind with the Seahawks. So you probably can't rely on them for a huge run of just great matchups, but at the same time, they have a very potent offense with Russell Wilson I'm going to talk about in a sec. So I think you should be fine for the most part, but they're not going to have just a stretch of, like the 49ers in the last video I made, they have a very light stretch to close their season, but Seattle doesn't really have something like that at the beginning and the end of their season. And now we will go to the quarterback position and Russell Wilson. So Russell Wilson, one of the best quarterbacks in the league. He is consistently performing around the top 5 range for quarterbacks over the past few seasons, and a lot of that is because he does give you a decent amount of value running the football as well. He doesn't have the mobility that he had in previous years, but he still gives you enough rushing yards to give you a solid floor that can buffer you some points in the event that he's struggling. And that's very important because Russell Wilson was one of the more turnover-prone quarterbacks last year, surprisingly. He was actually 31st in the league in terms of interceptions last year, throwing 13. He also threw for 40 touchdowns, so I mean that kind of helps cover it, as well as running for 513 yards. But the fact that he still finished 4th in spite of his interceptions is just proof that if you have a running quarterback, it really gives you a lot of room for error. So same applies to Russell Wilson. He's generally not a quarterback that you really have to reach for. If he's generally available around the middle of the drafts that I've seen this year so far. So you could probably get him at a pretty affordable price. The thing to keep an eye on with him, though, is that against some good defenses last year, he really struggled. His performance was kind of up and down at times. So if the Rams and 49ers defense are as good as advertised, there could be some difficult matchups for Russell Wilson there, in which he might be kind of more of a inhibitive player for you to do well than somebody that'll really help carry your team. So just keep that in mind, given the level of competition that he has to go against within his own division. But I still like him. I just think that he's somebody that what's going to happen in drafts is that there's going to start a game of people chasing quarterbacks, and somebody's going to take Patrick Mahomes second round or something like that, and then somebody's going to panic and then take like Aaron Rodgers in the fourth round or something, and that would just be a bad decision in my opinion. Or even the third round or something like that. And then it just starts a whole string of people taking quarterbacks and reaching, and you just end up costing yourself good skill position players when you do that. So now we will go to the backups. So their backup is still Geno Smith. I hope nothing happens to Russell Wilson, because it's going to be a significant drop-off on their offense if that were to happen. But yeah, just to keep in mind, Geno Smith is the backup quarterback in case anything were to happen to him. Running back. So the running back for the Seattle Seahawks is still Chris Carson. Chris Carson has been a pretty productive player for Seattle, given given his touches. Had a very good 2019 when Seattle heavily ran the ball and heavily got him involved in the offense. There were multiple games where he had at least 20 carries in 2019, but a very different story in 2020. In 2020, he never had a game over 20 attempts. He was very touchdown dependent last season. He did provide mild value in terms of PPR, but this was he dropped off quite a bit from his performance in 2019. I know a lot of that is due to injuries, but the other thing to keep in mind with him is that he's a very aggressive runner who is just going to push the pile, and that wears and tears running backs faster than guys like Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey. Danny Woodhead is an example of this. He was stuck around for quite a while. Darren Sproles is another example of this. You have more longevity if you're more of a speed back, and Chris Carson is very much the opposite of that. So I would not be surprised at all if there's a decline in his play that makes him a little bit of a reach for where he is. I think he's still a decent running back to have, but he's a guy that if you're going to have as one of your RB2 or hopefully not an RB1, but if you have him as a starting running back, you have to start developing backup plans for him, because I think that he could be relatively disappointing in terms of how he'll actually play. A lot of this will be dependent on what they do with volume, and there's a lot of other questions with the other running backs in this team that I'll talk about. But Chris Carson, always somebody that he's when he's good, but I just never really feel confident in him for some reason. So I think that the way he kind of dropped off a little bit last year is definitely concerning to me. But he doesn't really have too much to worry about in terms of his other running backs, because they're also got question marks. So Rashaad Penny, infamously a first-round draft pick who has very much not lived up to his hype. He's coming off, I believe, an ACL tear from last season, which he really didn't, even when he did have the opportunity to play, he didn't play very well. Throughout his 3 seasons in the league, I went back and looked at his games. He's only really had 300-yard games in which he actually performed well, but there's quite a few games in which he really put up very low yardage. There was some issues about him potentially not showing up in shape when he came in as a rookie. So if Rashaad Penny is going to take advantage of getting a starting back running job, this year would have to be the year that he would finally capitalize on it. Otherwise, I think he's going to very much be out of a job in the league and just end up being a journeyman at best moving forward. But he's I would not be surprised in a world where he eventually takes over the starting running back job and is a productive player for you in fantasy football this season. But he's not shown anything to suggest that based on his previous play. So I'm very concerned about him, but he's somebody, again, that if you have space on your bench and you're willing to give him time to see how this backfield develops, it's not a bad pickup in my opinion. But other guys that they have, Travis Homer, he's more of a PPR kind of player who can get some catches for you. Not really a workhorse back. He was kind of thrown into starting level roles last year given some of the injuries, but not really going to have much role other than pass catcher. And then Deejay Dallas, another guy who's he was relatively productive at times last year, but generally he's another guy that he really wasn't super efficient. So he's really going to have to show significant improvement in order to get time, considering all the other running backs ahead of him are now going to be healthy again. Wide receiver. So Seattle's wide receiver core is very much dominated by two players right now, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So first I will start with DK Metcalf, who's the player who's generally taken higher than him, and he's the one that I like more because he's generally a little more consistent and he's a younger player. So DK Metcalf, he's just a physical freak, very, very effective player. Started out the season very well, in which he caught several touchdowns. Appeared to be Russell Wilson's favorite target. But later on in the season, he struggled a little bit more. Specifically in the last game of the season against San Francisco, he only had 3 receptions for 21 yards. He only had 1 touchdown across his last 6 games. So Seattle's offense kind of stagnated a little bit last year, and I think a lot of that is because of the running game. They weren't really ever able to get going because of the injuries. So we'll see how this develops this year. But DK Metcalf has the highest room to improve because there's no doubt that he's an elite level talent. The question is the line going to be better enough this year in which Russell Wilson can have time to give him the ball? Because Russell Wilson, when he does have the protection to get the ball down the field, DK Metcalf was pretty effective. But when he wasn't, that's when kind of the performance slipped a little bit. So a good receiver to have, but it's gonna depend on how this offense improves, because there were times where he was a little bit inconsistent, but he wasn't as inconsistent as Tyler Lockett. So Tyler Lockett, he had an amazing game last year against Arizona where he had 15 receptions, 200 yards, and 3 touchdowns, which is probably one of the best receiver performances that we've seen all season last year. I have to go back and double check that specifically, but Lockett is way more up and down in terms of his performance. He does have some games where he gets multiple touchdowns. He had, in fact, 3 games last season where he had a total of 8 touchdowns, but then the rest of the season he only had 2 touchdowns across the other games that he played. So that just kind of shows you that his performance is a little more shaky. He always had at least 2 receptions a game. There were several games in which he only had 3 or 4. So he doesn't drop off as significantly as some of the players that you have, like some of these younger receivers that'll go from 100-yard game to 0 catches the next week. But he's still one of those guys that's generally inconsistent. And given his age being a little bit older than DK Metcalf, I'd rather have Metcalf. But Tyler Lockett, I think, is somebody that you can have on your team and can give you some good value from time to time, especially as his offense improves. There might be some opportunity for him to have better performances this season. Or more consistent performances. I mean, it's kind of hard to get better than 15, 203 in terms of a individual game performance. So other receivers, they have Freddie Swain, is somebody who's been on the team. He's listed as their third receiver, but he doesn't really present a lot of upside, so I'm not super excited about him. But the player I am more excited about is Eskridge, who is a second-round pick that they took out of Western Michigan. He's one of only 3 players that they drafted this season. Ding, ding, ding. That's my trivia question. If you listen to that, they only drafted 3 players this season. So comment that below if you stayed to this point in the video. But Eskridge is a player that, given that they only really have 2 receivers that have been consistent for them and or project to be consistent for them on Seattle this season, he's got a lot of opportunity to step up as the third receiver. So I like Eskridge, especially in deeper leagues, as a guy you can stash on your bench, see how it develops, because I think Seattle is going to end up throwing the ball quite a bit in some of these games, and Eskridge could be that player that they kind of drop coverage on a little bit to pay attention to DK Metcalf, and could take advantage of that. So he's a player that I like, who's not really getting a ton of attention, but again, some of these receivers that end up being great in the NFL are people that you get second, third, fourth, etc. That kind of surprise people. So just keep an eye out for that. They've got some other players as well on their team, like Penny Hart, Cade Johnson, John Ursua. John Ursua was their draft pick from a couple years ago, I believe, in the second round. So they've got some players, but I think that a lot of these guys are younger. There's only really Metcalf, Lockett, and Eskridge are the ones that I'm really serious about. But we'll see who they keep on the roster of the remaining people, because they could have some opportunity in case of injuries. Tight end. So tight end, I think, is going to be a good position for Seattle. They brought over Gerald Everett from the Los Angeles Rams, and he's going to have an opportunity to kind of take the reins of the tight end that they really haven't had since they had a guy like Jimmy Graham. They've been trying to replicate that level of success, but tried some various players who haven't really panned out. Gerald Everett could be the guy to do that. He's had some very good games with Los Angeles over the past few seasons, and he's going to have a lot of opportunity on this team. So I like Gerald Everett, and I think that he's a guy that I like. The other thing I like, too, is he's not getting taken particularly high. So he's going to have opportunity to score touchdowns, given Russell Wilson, given the lack of secondary receivers that are very good on this team. But he's also going to be relatively attainable. So I think if you were to just wait for a tight end, Gerald Everett is a good guy to target, to kind of use as a tight end that you can pick up later in the draft. So I'm a fan of him, and I think he could be a very productive player this year who could surprise some people. Other players they have, Will Dissly. Will Dissly he's a guy who's also dealt with injuries quite a bit his first 2 seasons in the league, but he has been productive too. I could see a situation in which he takes a little bit away from Everett, but until he starts proving to be a little more healthy, or unless anything happens to Everett, I'm not interested in him as a roster add. So now we move to the defense. The defense has talented players, but their overall performance has not been as good. Last season it started off especially poor. They did improve as the season went along, and I think there's optimism that they'll continue to improve. But they had some contract issues with Jamal Adams over the offseason, who is their number 1 player. So how's he going to show up ready for camp? Bobby Wagner is getting older as well. So there's questions about how this team is going to hold up defensively that kind of makes me wonder a little bit about their performance. But they're going to be a waiver wire team available, and I think there could be some good matchups for them, but they're not a team I'm really interested in drafting at all, or even really starting the season with. And then their kicker is Jason Myers. Jason Myers is a solid kicker to own in fantasy football. One of the top performers last year in fantasy football, and he has a very good leg, but he's also pretty accurate as well. So a guy that I like that you can get in the last round of the draft, and given the offensive opportunity that he's going to get with the Seahawks, he's going to be a good kicker, especially if the running back game struggles to get in the end zone. Let's say Chris Carson is worn down and he's not really effective in the red zone this year, then maybe Jason Myers could get a lot of field goals, and I think that could be a good situation if you own him as your kicker. All right, well, that's all I got for Seattle. 3 teams left. We only have a few of these teams left. I'm going to get into more specific strategy on positions as well as we get closer to the season. But stay tuned if you're interested in videos like these, and consider commenting, or subscribing. Also, comment your questions below, and I will answer them. So to take advantage of that, because I haven't really been getting a lot of that. I know there's people watching this, but if you comment your fantasy football questions, I will answer them. All right. Well, thank you. I'll see you guys. Bye.